Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us and taking some time out of your busy day. So although we've had 10 months of working from home, it feels really, really strange to be doing this from home. I've literally got no idea whether there's anywhere between 0 people watching or a couple of hundred people. So it's a very strange experience for me. I'd like to start by apologizing for the almost inevitable Wi-Fi freeze at some point. It will be the most interesting bit that will get frozen, and I'm sorry about that. And also apologize for the likely interruption of some crying children at some point as we go through this as well. So through all of that, I want to talk to you about something that I think can be a relatively easy thing to improve on, but can also be really high impact for finance leaders. But firstly, a quick introduction. I'm the finance director for Engine Group. Engine is the largest independent marketing services business in the UK with 100 million of revenues, and we work for many of the country's biggest brands and major organizations. We help them with everything from defining their brand purpose, their big brand advertising campaigns, their PR, social influencer, right through to helping them on their digital transformation journey and how better to understand how they can better leverage data through their organization. We've got over 500 clients in sectors from FMCG, financials, insurance, pharma, automotive, retail, and we also work with several big government departments and charitable organizations. This broad range has given us a pretty valuable insight into different sectors and how they've been impacted over the last 12 months. I'm really delighted to have the chance to talk to you about something that I think is really, really important. Something that we need to be thinking about more as we develop our skill sets and build teams around us. Over the next couple of days, there are going to be lots of good discussions on better use of technology to enable finance to be more efficient, machine learning, AI, how do we cope with ever more complex reporting requirements and the growing quantities and sources of data. All of that stuff is really important, but this is definitely not a talk about any of that. For me, for all finance leaders, I think something else is going to be much, much more important in the future. The key challenge for all senior finance leaders is how do we actually make all this data and technology work for us to help us solve real problems within our organizations. Those could be small tactical problems, or they could be big strategic problems. They might be clearly anticipated and seen in advance, or, as was the case for much of last year, unexpected, unprecedented problems of unimagined magnitude. Regardless, I think the finance team are uniquely placed within most organizations to bring together the various data sets internally, externally, model the potential impacts of different options. This is where I believe the most effective finance leaders will be operating, repeatedly asking themselves, what key problem or problems am I focused on solving right now? So a short quote from the eminent philosopher, Captain Jack Sparrow. The problem is not the problem is your attitude about the problem. I think we need to step back, look at the problem correctly and embrace our role as the chief problem solvers within organizations. I really, really believe that this is something that we can actually get better at doing, that there are real practical steps we can take to ensure we are more effective problem solvers and we avoid some simple mistakes. I also think that we can help future finance leaders develop the skills that they will need to make them more effective as problem solvers. But I think there is a risk. If we do not make use of the privileged position we have at the top table, use the data that increasingly flows through every business, then other functions will step to tell that story, and we will be reduced to reporting the facts rather than driving change. Today, I'm going to try and cover this in a few stages. Firstly, I'm going to share a few number of stories or challenges that I've been heavily involved in my current role or previous roles, and what we learned from dealing with some of those. I've tried to build out a very simple 3-step framework of problem solving for finance leaders. There's rocket science here, and this definitely isn't an academic talk on the merits of different problem solving methodologies. Finally, and the thing I'd really like your input on, is what do we as finance professionals need to do to ensure we're stepping into the challenge of solving big, complex, multidimensional problems? And how do we make sure we have the right people within our teams to do that as well? So like I said, firstly, I'm going to share a few stories from my career when things have gone well, or more often than not, where things have not gone so well, and what I hope I have learned and improved in the future as a result of some of that. And firstly, I'm going to start with something fairly recent that I think everyone can relate to, and that's how do we navigate our way through 2020 and a very unexpected global pandemic. As COVID started to make its impact felt on the business in March last year, we sent everyone home to work, thinking it was maybe a couple of weeks, and here we are, some 10 months on, and I don't know about anyone else, I spent about 4 days in the office in the intervening time. We were suddenly faced with huge, unprecedented uncertainty like so many others. Given the range of clients we've got and the number of sectors and services, actually the impact for us on our business was not uniform. In some areas, we were busier than we'd ever been, and client demand was scaling very quickly. In other areas, client activity was significantly reduced pretty much overnight in ways that none of our models or projections could have forecast. We had to find a way to navigate through this period, requiring that we ensured we had sufficient liquidity, but also that we were balancing that with a look to the longer term. The key unknowns being, how long is any of this going to last? How deep is the reduction in demand going to be? And what of those changes are going to be permanent? And what changes are going to revert back to pre-COVID times in the future? There was that very immediate sense of priority and urgency that you only ever get with a very, very real crisis. But for me, telling the story around the boardroom table was still a real challenge. There was very limited real data to base any decisions upon. What data we did have was quickly being overtaken by events as things changed and the seriousness of the situation became more apparent. And also the government response was evolving at speed with the different packages and the different support things that they were pushing out. So the framework we were operating in was constantly changing as well. So we were facing a situation where we had, in certain areas, material reductions in revenue, no certainty as to when, or in some cases, even if that would return. How did we handle that situation? Well, firstly, flexibility was key. Our usual process for developing an updated forecast simply wasn't agile enough and quick enough for what we were dealing with. The numbers that we got through that weren't going to provide any clarity to us, because by the time they'd flow through that review process, they were going to be out of date. We quite quickly prepared 3 different top-down models based on the likely length, the severity, and the impact of the downturn, a high, medium, and low forecast. Secondly, we were then able to systematically go through all the levers that were available to us, from those that were relatively easy, right through to some extremely tough calls that none of us really wanted to contemplate having to take. Through the combination of this model, we were able to build out a short-term cost reduction plan that preserved liquidity and gave us a runway through things. This included things like short-term part-time working, salary reductions, a temporary pause on new hires, and a reduction in discretionary spend. Certainly 2020's cut in the T&E budget was one of the easiest savings I've ever made. Really importantly though, we were also clear on what else we would need to do if the impact worsened over our current baseline modelling. So we knew what the next steps would be and what we would do if we needed to. Then, while we were still implementing that plan, we immediately revisited our 3 scenarios and took a longer term view. What areas where demand had either increased or decreased were likely to be permanent? With this, we were able to go through a process of reviewing the areas of the business where we saw increased demand or opportunity and needed to scale up our ambitions and find ways to invest more behind it. At the same time, we had several areas where it's apparent that the reduction in revenue was likely to be a longer term fixture and that we'd have no choice but to look at scaling back our investments. These were definitely the harder decisions to make. By reducing our footprint in one area, we would find ourselves missing out if there was a sudden or swift rebound. But at the same time, if we spread our resources too thinly, we would not be as competitive as we needed to be, where we saw the real growth opportunities. We spent some time working on this, probably longer than we needed to, but eventually a clear focus came into play when we got clear what we were really aiming towards. It wasn't about protecting profitability in 2020. It wasn't about trying to be the biggest business we could possibly be. It was really about how, on the other side of this pandemic, whether that's early or late 2021, how do we position ourselves best for growth? Once we'd got that clear primary objective sorted, it was much easier to make the decisions on where we invest and where we scale back. Looking back now with a bit of distance passed from those early days of the pandemic, what did we get right and what did we get wrong? And what do we learn? I think we did a good job of moving quickly. And of course, the global pandemic gives everyone that sense of urgency is required. At the same time, where there were tough calls to make, we spent time properly going through them rather than rushing and feeling panicked. However, I think we could have been swifter in agreeing what our primary objective was, that mix between short-term survival and long-term prosperity. When we've been able to get that clear, a lot of things snapped into place for us. Finally, I think we could have done a better job at getting more perspectives and points of view on board earlier. We kind of retreated a little bit into a bunker mentality that I think didn't help make the best decisions at all times. From a finance point of view, my big learnings around problem solving more generally, my key takeaways: you need a way to build a quick model of the future. When things are changing this fast, your normal business processes aren't likely to be fast enough. Certainly ours weren't, and most people I speak to were in the same camp. Second, flexible and fast is better than precise and slow. Sometimes Excel is actually just the right tool for the job. And then finally, most importantly, make sure everyone is focusing on the same bigger picture goal. Actually agree what is the problem that we're trying to solve. I'd like to share a couple of other stories from earlier times and different organizations, how they've helped me to think differently about the right approach to dealing with different challenges. I'll start with a great lesson I learned on dispute resolution working with one of my CEOs many, many years ago. Somehow or other, we'd managed to get into a dispute with a pretty difficult supplier. We had verbally given the go-ahead to proceed with an order based on the client's say-so. And then, as so often happens, the client changed their mind and we had to try and walk it all back the next day. We thought we were being reasonable and offered to settle whatever costs they'd incurred in the 3 hours they'd been able to work on it. They responded fairly differently, threatening to sue us and indeed the client for breach of contracts, and that they were going to be phoning the client's CEO within the hour if we didn't agree a pretty outrageous settlement. The client team, conscious that they had dropped us in it, were also significantly worried about what this was going to do to their client relationship. And the supplier decided that the finance director was the person he was going to phone up and yell at, even though I'd not been involved. So, faced with an angry supplier, a worried client team, how did we look to get through this? As the young and naive finance director I was at the time, I quite possibly have caved and settled for much more than we needed to, just to try and make the problem go away. But my CEO at the time demonstrated his fearsome poker skills. He very effectively put himself in their headspace, calculated quite correctly that they were chancing their arm a little, and that we should continue to hold our position, treat them reasonably and fairly, but not be rattled by them. We let several of their deadlines pass, and a string of ultimatums ignored, as the voicemails that I was getting became angrier and angrier, louder and louder. And as 24 hours passed, it became apparent that they were bluffing and that they weren't going to phone the client. And eventually we settled for scarcely more than we'd offered them 24 hours earlier, and the client was left in peace. If I learned one thing through that process, it was really that calm and logical beats angry and emotional every day of the week. So keeping that focus is super important. In another case, in a former role, I was trying to get a tricky acquisition sorted. After many months of hard slog, we'd agreed terms with the vendor. We went through our due diligence and arranging the various approvals we needed. At the same time, that little voice on my shoulder was bugging me that something wasn't quite right. So I kept on going around, asking more questions, slowing things down, doing more due diligence. Eventually, we reached a point where we either had to press the button and go and call the whole thing off, or not. The data said, go ahead. The voice on my shoulder said, call it off. We had our board meeting. I talked things through with the CEO and the board, and we discussed our options. Eventually, given every data point said we should proceed, we decided to go ahead. And then, predictably enough, the guaranteed lifelong clients that we've spoken to as part of our due diligence in advance started to reduce orders, cancel contracts, and within a quarter of closing the deal, the revenue stream was starting to be significantly below our expectations. 12 months on, it was apparent that none of the numbers that we thought we were going to hit were met. If I learned one thing here, it's the data is great and really important, but also you need to listen to your gut instincts. In all of these cases, we're dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity, and sometimes you know, even if you're not quite sure why you know. And then a final story, and one that I'm sure many people here will be familiar with, a new systems implementation. Naively, we bought the dream, a system that could do almost everything we needed, be easily adaptable where we needed it to be, and up and running in no time at virtually no cost. Could make you a cup of tea and a slice of toast in the morning as well. Sadly, it turned out not to be quite like that. The project repeatedly missed its deadlines, blew budgets despite huge commitment, hard work from everyone involved in the project team, and the blame game starts. For the project team, it was the vendor's fault for not delivering what they'd promised. It was also the implementation partner's fault for not really understanding the business. And it was the business's fault for not engaging with the project properly. Everyone else was pointing fingers at the project team. It was their fault. They hadn't set realistic expectations, done their due diligence, or engaged with enough people properly. We would go through a couple of iterations here. Everyone would get very frustrated at missed deadlines. We would have a big reset meeting with new timelines and budgets. We'd beef up our corporate governance, and we'd get some more project managers involved to make sure things didn't happen again. And then with our new timeline that we thought was very, very realistic, and we'd probably be beating it rather than missing it, we'd walk out of the room. And almost inevitably, we'd proceed to carry on exactly as before, with very obviously the exact same outcome. Another set of missed deadlines, blown budgets, and frustration all round. We carried on in this pattern for some time, and the board was now starting to ask for more detailed and slightly ominous sounding project reviews, and I found myself at the center of the storm. The business had lost faith with the team, the vendor, and the partner, and was looking to cut and run. While it seemed like the easy thing to do, I was concerned. I thought that we'd just end up on day one with a different system, but all the same problems implementing it. Eventually, I was able to find help from someone senior at the vendor who'd done this more times than any of the rest of us combined, and who was ready to call things as it was. Yes, there was blame on all sides and everyone had to take some responsibility, but ultimately the project team and the business had to take accountability rather than blaming external parties. Either we had to scale up our resources or reduce the scope of what we were doing and make sure we actually delivered something. It was kind of an aha moment. We were able to agree a smaller scope, and suddenly we're actually able to agree a timeline that we're able to hit and meet, and that we were able to launch something that was of value and salvage something from a project that nearly went completely off the rails. What did I learn from this one? Well, firstly, tech implementations are really, really, really hard. I've done a couple now. It takes longer and costs more than you ever think it will. Secondly, my key takeaway was if something's gone wrong repeatedly in the past, it's going to keep on going wrong again. That wishful thinking that this time we'll crack it, this time we'll get it right, till you fundamentally address the hard truth about what's happening, you're not going to make different progress and you're not going to have different outcomes. So 4 stories from me, and I think everyone who's been doing this sort of job for a while has their own war stories, and they're probably fairly similar in lots of ways. And while every problem is bespoke in some ways, it does seem that we spend significant amounts of our time trying to puzzle our way through different issues. So to try and avoid repeating some of the same mistakes from the past, try to make sure I go through a fairly repeatable 3-step process with each challenge. Like I say, I'm a big believer in keeping these things simple. So for me, it's pretty straightforward. But the key thing is, how do we become better at problem solving and reach better outcomes faster? So my 3-step process. Firstly, it's about storytelling. This is the hardest part, and it's the part that we most often skip. We know the problem, or at least we believe we do, so we jump straight into solving it. But very often we haven't done the hard work to really understand the problem. And then equally importantly, ensure that all those involved in resolving it with us are starting from the same place. Here, I believe that finance should be really well placed to lead. In most cases, we have access to the best data. We are one of the few parts of the organization that has a view on everything that is happening, from sales to marketing to product development. And if we're doing our jobs well, we have a good view on the external environment, our customers, consumers in general, and what our competitors are doing. But too often, I think we're guilty of providing the data and the charts, but allowing others to take the lead in telling that story. A couple of tools that can be helpful here. Firstly, if you come across the fishbone diagrams, or otherwise known as Ishikawa diagrams, really great at uncovering the real underlying problem you need to focus on. There are also lots of really valuable templates online for performing root cause analysis, but really getting back to what is it that we should be solving and working on here is absolutely key. I find that time spent here setting the scene is the most valuable thing, and the thing that too often we skip over. Once we've got everyone aligned on the story, what the problem is that we're really trying to solve, the next step, working through the options. The temptation is often to rely on some unlikely outside event to magically get you out of a hole, a reversion to client spending patterns that have long since vanished, a team that have missed every client deadline suddenly hitting all of them in a row. I think we as finance need to be ready to call this out for the wishful thinking it almost certainly is. Instead, here we need lots of why questions, a range of different points of view and perspectives, and then a dispassionate approach and a healthy dose of realism as we sift through the options, modeling the different scenarios to move towards a recommendation. Again, finance should be well placed to drive this part of the process. Any exploration of the different courses of action will usually involve a financial assessment and a range of possible outcomes. The ability to prepare financial models that do that and give that flexibility are going to be key. One thing I've found helpful to consider here is something that Jeff Bezos at Amazon has talked about. He talks about two types of decisions: one-way door decisions, those that you can't really walk back if you turn out to have made a mistake, and two-way door decisions, those that if in a quarter or two quarters it turns out were wrong, you can just undo. Those easily reversible two-way door decisions benefit from being made reasonably quickly and not eating up loads and loads of senior management time, while those one-way door decisions are worth making sure you've really spent your time and energy on before you commit. I find it a really helpful distinction. In my experience, too much time and energy is spent on deciding a course of action for those two-way door decisions that doesn't need it. And then finally, making a decision. There comes that point where a leap into the unknown has got to happen, and this is about influencing skills to get people on board with the best course of action. Again, in my experience, where there's uncertainty and risk, there's always inertia that stops things from moving. The temptation here is often to move back to stage two, spend more time looking for that option that avoids having to take the really tough calls, the compromise way forward. Again, a data-led, emotion-free approach to picking the best of the options is an area where finance skills should come to the fore. I recently read something that Barack Obama talked about for decision-making, and his key observation was that almost none of the decisions that landed on his desk had a clearly right or wrong answer. If they had, someone had already made it before it got anywhere near his office. Whilst obviously most corporate decisions are nowhere near the magnitude of those being taken in the Oval Office, I think the thought is still relevant. If a management team or board is puzzling over the right thing to do, then there almost certainly isn't a 100% correct answer, because if so, someone should have made it already. It requires us to be comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. This should be an area of strength for numerate finance leaders able to quantify that risk. But in my experience, when there is uncertainty, many of us look to minimize risk as the responsible corporate guardian that we see ourselves playing. So that's my pretty simple three-step process for solving problems. Firstly, storytelling. This is where the heavy lifting needs to be. Secondly, building out the options. And then finally, a decision and moving forward. Like I said, there's no rocket science behind any of this, but I find a clear focus on going through three logical steps has been helpful to me and others I work with. How many times we all jump straight to trying to solve the problem without everyone agreeing what we're actually trying to solve? or thought properly about the range of options that are open to us. Next, I think that one of the fundamental challenges for all of us is how do we hire, train, and develop people within the finance function to be great problem solvers? So much finance training development builds a group of people who are great at understanding and operating within a set framework. Yet the ability to solve problems requires integrated thinking and creativity. Clearly, any attempt at problem solving relies on a strong analytical mindset. And this is an area where finance professionals should already be excelling and adding a huge amount of value. However, I think there are three other key traits here. Firstly, a creative mindset, the ability to consider a wide range of possible causes and solutions to any challenge, the ability to make lateral connections or combinations that don't appear immediately obvious. I think it's fair to say that this isn't something that most people see as a core skill in finance. Indeed, the very word creative has negative connotations when tied together with accounting. But if we want to continue to add value and be an important voice around the boardroom table, as more and more tasks become automated, I think finding that creative spirit is going to be key. We need to think actively about how we develop finance professionals who are comfortable with this and encourage rather than discourage it. So how can we all become more creative? Like anything else, practicing something makes it easier. 4 well-proven tips are: 1, focus on generating lots and lots of ideas. 2, suspend judgment whilst generating those ideas. 3, restate problems as questions. And 4, use yes and statements rather than no but statements. I know I and several other FDs I've worked with are guilty of the no but as the stock response rather than yes and. Secondly, we need to be much more flexible with our thinking, comfortable with ambiguity. Again, much of our accounting training is about a set of guidelines and standards that gets you to a right answer. But increasingly big corporate decisions have degrees of uncertainty. Those who are going to succeed most often are those who are able to quantify the uncertainty and then commit to a course of action. Comfortable that in the fullness of time it might prove to have been the wrong choice. We need to be less risk averse. A couple of tips that I found helpful with other people, getting comfortable with ambiguity. Firstly, be comfortable saying, I don't know yet, and role model that with your teams. It doesn't shut down the possibilities, and it doesn't suggest that there's an easy answer. Second, asking what you could do instead of asking what you should do opens up many more possibilities. Should suggests there is only one course of action. Could gives you many possibilities to explore. And then lastly, it's about influencing skills. If we compare finance to other professions such as sales and marketing, who are just masters of creating a narrative that is designed to influence people to their preferred outcome, finance often comes up short. Possibly the most important skill for finance leaders in the future is the ability to talk about data and create a story from it that non-finance professionals can relate to. Here, there is a wealth of material available around active listening and influencing skills and how to become more effective at it. If I had to share one single tip, I think the simplest thing and the most effective thing I've found to work is to always try and put yourself in the other person's position. Think about what they want, what their fears and worries are, what their preconceived ideas may be. And once you've done that and got into their headspace a bit, you're much more likely to make faster progress. So those are my 3 qualities that I think are going to be super important for finance leaders in the future. A couple of simple tips for better problem solving. Firstly, and these are all pretty simple, get everyone to agree what the actual problem is. Next, the financial modeling needs to be agile and be able to pull together very quickly. 3, spend more time on the understanding of the issues rather than jumping to the solution. 4, consider a range of possible next steps, even those that seem unpalatable, and test the edge cases. Try and deal with things unemotionally and rationally. Bring in divergent points of view and perspectives. And then lastly, and probably most importantly here, give yourself some time to reflect on the final call before going ahead. Don't feel rushed to make that key decision. I found this quote from Albert Einstein really useful as a way of thinking about it. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. That first storytelling step is so key here. So thank you very much. For those that have stuck with it, thank you so much for your time today. I hope I've convinced you that in the age of machines, we can still add huge value by solving those complex problems. And it is something that we can all become more effective at doing with fairly minimal effort required to make that change. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to hear them.
Thanks for that, Will. Really good presentation, really good advice and insights there.
Thank you.
Let me dive straight into a couple of the questions. We've had one come through from Mark, and Mark's asked, at the beginning, you mentioned some of the areas that you've learned as a result of COVID, namely urgency and swift response times. COVID has been a struggle for many, resulting in a lot of problems and negativities. However, have there been any previously unforeseen opportunities or positives that you've seen as a result of COVID?
Yeah, great question. And there absolutely have. I think we have been able to make a number of changes a lot faster than we ever thought was possible. So one of the things that we were working on pre-COVID was, how do we enable people to work more flexibly and in a more fluid manner? So that's both, when during the week and the day do they work, but also geographically, where do they work? And obviously, there was a lot of nervousness around some of the managers around that. And, people are very comfortable with trusting employees to get on with their work when you can see them all sat at their desks. But if you can't see them, how do you have that trust? And actually, through the enforced working from home experiment, we've moved very quickly there. So there have been a number of things there that have been much faster and much easier to change than we thought possible beforehand. So that's definitely one area. And then I think the race to do more and more online has created as many opportunities as it's created challenges for different businesses. So for us, it's been about how do we pivot faster to make sure we're taking advantage of those opportunities that come up. So yes, there have definitely been things that have been easier to change or easier to achieve through the last 12 months than we thought they would be before.
Excellent, thanks. A question that's come through from Anne, and Anne has asked, can you recommend any soft training skills potentially outside of work that you would recommend to upskill the middle of the road finance director?
Yeah, I think if I had to pick one thing, I think it would be looking for something around influencing skills. I think that's the key thing that I've seen over the years, that very solid, capable accountants trying to make that step up to more senior roles sometimes struggle with. So the ability, to understand things from different perspectives, understand different people's point of view on things, put yourself in their shoes, and tell a story in a way that they're going to relate to it, I think is probably the single key thing that separates those that can engage around the board table and those that are kind of stuck with Excel and calculators. So that would be the one key thing that I think everyone is going to need more and more of.
Brilliant, thank you. And then one last question is coming through from Joe, who's asked, if you could rerun the system implementation that you struggled through, what would you focus on and what would you change? We're currently going through a system implementation with a few kinks.
I think, so I've done two now, both of them went over budget and over timeline. So whatever you think, I think adding more time and adding more money is probably the first thing. And the second thing that has really worked is narrowing it down to a core scope of what you're going to deliver. So typically these systems promise that they can do everything from end to end in the process. If you're actually able to launch a core thing and then first build some momentum and confidence around it, and then add on some other things afterwards, that's going to help as well. For me, the kind of moment when we started making faster progress was when we took ownership of it ourselves and realized that we were the ones. If it wasn't working, it was on us. it wasn't necessarily the supplier, it wasn't the outside consultants. We were the ones that had to take responsibility for getting it done. Whatever that meant, was kind of the moment when we started to move forward faster. But yeah, they're hard work, so good luck with it.